Good morning and welcome. We are continuing our daily video devotions to the book of 2 Samuel with 2 Samuel chapter 5. So wherever you're at, we are just so glad that you're joining us today. Now, today actually marks the event of something that 1 and 2 Samuel have been working towards for so very long. If you've read along with us through 1 Samuel and as we've began 2 Samuel, you'll know in a lot of ways it's the story about David waiting for his turn to finally arrive to be named king over Israel. If you'll remember, the first king of Israel was a guy by the name of Saul, and that not long into being king, Saul did things that weren't necessarily obedient towards God, things that certainly weren't righteous, and God rejected Saul as king. Now, as we know, that didn't mean Saul ceased to be king in that moment. Saul continued to be king for quite a long time. But what it did mean is that in that moment, God decided to seek after and to anoint the man who would become the next king over Israel, and that man was none other than David. Well, by the time we reach 2 Samuel 5 and David is finally named king over Israel, years, decades even, have passed since that day that the prophet Samuel anointed David to be the next king over Israel. And I'm not going to talk a lot about the specifics about how David becomes king and the specifics about what happens in the rest of chapter 5. Instead, I want to talk about how David provides us with this remarkable example of what it means to trust in God's goodness, what it means to trust in God's faithfulness, but more specifically, what it means to trust in God's timing. Now, I don't know about you, but so often in this life, things that I desperately want don't go my way, or they don't occur in the amount of time that I hoped they would. And in those moments, it can be so easy to lose faith in God. It can be so easy to lose our sense of hope. It can be so easy to question and to doubt God's faithfulness and God's goodness to us. And if you've read along with us so far through 1 and 2 Samuel, you'll know there are so many opportunities in David's story and David's life when, if I was him, I would have certainly questioned God's goodness. I would have certainly questioned God's promises. I would have questioned God's faithfulness. But what makes David so remarkable is that he never did. And see, here, some 30 years after, maybe 20 years after, God initially made that promise to him. When God initially anointed him as the next king over Israel, God finally fulfills that promise. And what's so remarkable to me is there was never an occasion, there was never a single instance of David doubting God's goodness to him, doubting God's faithfulness, doubting God's timing. And see, I think there's a lesson, such a profound lesson for us in David's story. He's not a perfect person, and like I said, we'll see more of his imperfections a little bit later in 2 Samuel now that he's become king. But David was undoubtedly a faithful person. He was a person who trusted in God, a person who believed that God was good and believed without a question of a doubt that God would be faithful to him, and he lived his life in accordance with those beliefs. So the next time you face adversity or challenges or uncertainty in your life, the next time something doesn't necessarily go the way you hoped it would, remember David. Remember his faithfulness. Remember his patience. Remember his willingness to always believe in God's goodness and God's faithfulness to him, no matter what the things in the world around him might want him to believe. So I'll leave you with that this morning, and we'll see you again on Thursday for 2 Samuel chapter 6.